The dust settled over Redemption Creek like a shroud, and with it, Catherine Mercer's last shred of hope. She stood at the general store counter, her trembling fingers clutching the only thing of value she had left, her late husband's silver pocket watch. The merchant, a round man with calculating eyes, barely glanced at it. $2, he grunted. That's all I can offer. $2. It wouldn't even cover a week's rent on the miserable room above the saloon where she'd been staying since Sheriff Thomas Mercer had been gunned down 3 months ago. Catherine's throat tightened. The town had forgotten her husband quickly, and with him, any obligation they felt toward his widow. Before we continue with Catherine's journey, I'd love to ask you to take a moment to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and give this video a like. Your support truly means everything to us and motivates us to bring you more quality content like this. I'm also curious, where are you listening from today? Please let me know in the comments below. I'll give you 20 for it, a deep voice said from behind her. Catherine spun around, her heart lurching. The man who'd spoken stood in the doorway, backlit by the harsh afternoon sun. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and eyes the color of a winter storm. He wore dusty trail clothes and a gun belt that sat low on his hips, with the ease of someone who knew how to use it. The merchant's face went pale. "Mr. Holloway, I didn't see you come in." Holloway. The name struck Catherine like a physical blow. Cade Holloway, the outlaw her husband had been hunting when he died. The man responsible for robbing the Butterfield stage 6 times in 2 years. The ghost that haunted every wanted poster from here to Santa Fe. "That won't be necessary," Catherine said, her voice steadier than she felt. She snatched the watch from the counter and clutched it to her chest. "I'm not selling to you." Cade stepped fully into the store, and the merchant scrambled backward, suddenly finding urgent business in the storeroom. Cade's gaze never left Catherine's face. Up close, she could see the scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, the shadow of stubble on his jaw, the way his eyes assessed her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You're Tom Mercer's widow," he said. It wasn't a question. "And you're the man who made me one." Something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe, or regret. "I didn't kill your husband, Mrs. Mercer. Your gang did. That's close enough." But even as she said it, doubt crept in. She'd heard whispers, rumors that her husband's death hadn't been what it seemed, that it had been an inside job, someone in the town who wanted him silenced. "Come with me," Cade said quietly. "There's something you need to know." "I'm not going anywhere with you." "Even if I can tell you who really killed Tom? Even if I can prove it?" Catherine's breath caught. She wanted to refuse, wanted to cling to the simple narrative that this outlaw was her enemy. But the truth was, she had nothing left to lose. The town had turned its back on her. The pension she was owed had mysteriously vanished into the mayor's administrative costs. She was 3 days from being thrown into the street. "1 hour," she said. "You have 1 hour to convince me." Cade's lips quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's all I need." He took her to a cabin hidden in the cottonwoods along the creek, a small structure that looked abandoned from the outside, but proved surprisingly well kept within. There was a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a narrow bed covered with a Navajo blanket. Cade gestured for her to sit, then pulled a leather-bound journal from a saddlebag and placed it before her. "Your husband was investigating more than stage robberies," Cade said, standing by the window where he could watch the trail. He'd discovered that Mayor Blackwood and Marshal Kincaid were running guns to both sides of the Apache conflicts, selling to the cavalry at inflated prices, then stealing them back and selling them to the tribes. Tom was going to expose them. Catherine opened the journal with shaking hands. She recognized her husband's neat script immediately. Page after page of dates, shipment records, witness accounts. Her vision blurred with tears. Tom contacted me, Cade continued, asked me to help him gather evidence. Most of my robberies were actually intercepting those gun shipments. We were going to take everything to the territorial governor. Then why? Blackwood found out. He sent Kincaid to kill Tom and make it look like my gang did it. I wasn't even in the territory when it happened. Cade's jaw clenched. By the time I got back, Tom was dead, and I had a murder warrant on my head. Catherine felt the world tilt beneath her. Everything she'd believed for 3 months was a lie. She'd mourned her husband while living among his killers. "Why tell me this now?" she whispered. Cade turned from the window, and the look in his eyes was raw. "Because they're planning to kill you too. I heard them talking in the saloon last night. They think you might have found Tom's evidence. You've got maybe 2 days before they make their move." Terror flooded through her, followed quickly by rage. "Then I'll go to the territorial marshal. Kincaid's brother. They're all connected, Catherine." The use of her given name sent an unexpected warmth through her. "There's only one way out of this." "What?" "Let me protect you. Help me finish what Tom started. We expose them together, or we both die trying." She should have said no, should have run as far and fast as she could. But as she looked at this outlaw, this man her husband had trusted, she saw something in him that called to the part of her that refused to be a victim. "All right," she said, "but if you're lying to me, I'll let you shoot me yourself." He pulled a revolver from his belt and set it on the table between them. "Tom taught you how to use one of these?" Catherine picked up the gun, checked the cylinder with practiced ease, and aimed it directly at Cade's heart. "He taught me well." For the first time, Cade smiled, a real smile that transformed his hard face into something almost beautiful. "Good. You're going to need that fire." They spent the next 3 days gathering evidence and planning. Cade taught Catherine how to track, how to move silently through the brush, how to survive on the land. She cooked what game he brought back, and in the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked. She learned that Cade had been a cavalryman once, discharged for refusing an order to massacre a Cheyenne village of women and children. That he'd turned to robbing stages because the owners were corrupt officials who deserved it. That he sent most of his ill-gotten gains to the orphanage in Denver where he'd grown up. He learned that Catherine had been a schoolteacher before marrying Tom. That she'd taught herself to read Latin and Greek. That she'd married for practical reasons, but had come to love her husband deeply. That she was terrified of being alone, but more terrified of being weak. On the 4th night, a storm rolled in from the mountains, violent and sudden. Rain lashed the cabin windows, and thunder shook the walls. Catherine jerked awake from a nightmare, gasping, Tom's death playing behind her eyelids. Hey, Cade was there, kneeling beside the bed where she'd been sleeping. He must have given it to her and taken the floor. "You're safe. It's just thunder." But she couldn't stop shaking. The storm, the fear, the grief, it all crashed over her at once. Without thinking, she reached for him, and he gathered her into his arms, holding her as she wept against his chest. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm sorry. Don't." His hand stroked her hair, his voice rough. "Don't apologize for being human." She pulled back enough to look at him, and in the dim light from the dying fire, she saw the way he was looking at her, like she was something precious and breakable. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away her tears. "Catherine," he breathed, and she saw the war in his eyes, the desire and the restraint. "Don't let me be alone tonight," she whispered. "I won't." He pulled her closer, his arms solid and warm around her. "I've got you, I promise." They stayed like that, wrapped in each other as the storm raged outside, and Catherine felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just gratitude or fear-driven need. This was something deeper, more terrifying than any danger they faced. She was falling for the man who wore her husband's enemy's face. Morning brought clarity and danger in equal measure. Catherine woke to find Cade already up, checking his guns with methodical precision. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and impossibly bright. "We have to move today," he said, without preamble. "I saw tracks yesterday. Kincaid's men are searching the creek area." Catherine nodded, pushing aside the confusion of last night's intimacy. There would be time to examine her feelings later, if they survived. They packed quickly and headed north, toward the territorial capital. But they'd barely made 5 miles when Cade held up his hand, signaling her to stop. Ahead, through the trees, she could see riders. At least 6 of them, wearing marshals' badges that glinted in the sunlight. "They've cut us off," Cade murmured. He pulled Catherine from her horse and led both animals into a thick copse of junipers. "Stay quiet." They crouched in the shadows as the riders passed, within 20 feet, close enough that Catherine could hear their conversation. "Blackwood wants them both dead," one man said. "Says we can make it look like the outlaw kidnapped the widow and we heroically tried to save her. Shame about Mrs. Mercer," another laughed. "She was a pretty thing." Rage flooded through Catherine, hot and cleansing. These men had killed her husband, stolen her future, and now they spoke of her as if she were already dead. Her hand found the revolver at her belt. Cade's hand covered hers, his eyes warning her to wait. The riders moved on, but the danger was clear. They were surrounded, with enemies ahead and behind. "There's a canyon about 2 miles east," Cade said quietly. "Narrow entrance, easily defensible. If we can reach it, they'll trap us there." "Maybe, but it's better than dying in the open." He met her eyes. "Unless you want to run." "I can create a distraction, give you time to get away. You could make it to—" "No," Catherine's voice was steel. "We finish this together." Something blazed in Cade's expression. Pride, maybe, or something deeper. "Together," he agreed. They moved through the landscape like ghosts, using every bit of cover, every shadow. Twice they had to freeze as searchers passed nearby. "We'll make our stand here," Cade said, already scanning the approach for firing positions. "If they come at night—" The crack of a rifle shot cut off his words. Pain exploded across Catherine's arm as a bullet grazed her, and she gasped, stumbling. Cade caught her, pulling her behind cover as more shots rang out. "Are you hit?" His hands were already on her, checking the wound. It was superficial but bleeding freely. "I'm fine. They found us." "Not fine." Cade's face was grim as he tore a strip from his shirt and bound her arm with quick, efficient movements. "Go slow. It hurts," he murmured, his touch gentle despite the urgency. "I'll die before I hurt you," Catherine shot back, trying for humor, but hearing the tremor in her own voice. Cade's eyes met hers, fierce and tender at once. No one's dying today. You understand me? No one. But as the sun set and their attackers positioned themselves around the canyon entrance, Catherine knew the odds were against them. 7 men, maybe 8, all armed and trained, against one outlaw and a widow who'd learned to shoot 3 months ago. The first assault came at dusk. Cade fired with deadly precision, dropping 2 men before the others pulled back. But ammunition was limited, and their enemies knew it. "We need a miracle," Catherine said, reloading her revolver with fingers that only shook a little. "Or a fire." Cade was looking at the dry brush that lined the canyon approaches. "Wind's blowing toward them. If we can get it started, it'll smoke us out too. Not if we time it right. When they charge again, we light it. The smoke will cover our escape up the back trail." "What back trail?" Cade's grin was almost feral. "The one I'm betting exists. These canyons always have a way out. You just have to be willing to climb for it." It was insane, but Catherine found herself grinning back. Tom always said I needed more adventure in my life. Tom was a smart man. Cade handed her a torch he'd fashioned from a branch and dried grass. "On my signal." The second assault came an hour later, coordinated and aggressive. Cade's rifle barked steadily, and Catherine fired her revolver until the hammer clicked on empty cylinders. Then Cade threw his torch, and Catherine threw hers, and the dry brush exploded into flame. Smoke billowed up, thick and choking. Now, Cade grabbed Catherine's hand, and they ran deeper into the canyon. Behind them, she could hear shouting, confusion, the crack of flames consuming brush. The back trail turned out to be less a trail, and more a series of hand and footholds up a sheer rock face. Cade went first, testing each hold, then coaching Catherine up behind him. Her arms screamed in protest, blood soaking through the makeshift bandage. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. They were 20 feet up when the first shots rang out again. Someone had seen them through the smoke. A bullet sparked off the rock beside Catherine's head, and she felt Cade's hand grip her wrist, hauling her up the last few feet to a ledge. "Keep moving," he gasped. "Don't look back." The climb seemed endless. Catherine's muscles burned, her wounded arm barely functional. Below, she could hear their pursuers starting up after them. Then, Cade was pulling her over the top, onto a flat mesa that stretched away into the darkening desert. "The horses," Catherine panted. "Gone. We go on foot from here." They ran through the gathering darkness, stumbling over rocks and sage, driven by the sounds of pursuit behind them. Catherine's lungs burned, her vision starting to blur from blood loss and exhaustion. But every time she faltered, Cade was there, his hand in hers, his voice in her ear. "Stay with me. Stay with me. Together." Together, the word became a mantra, a prayer. They ran until the desert swallowed them whole, until the sounds of pursuit faded into the vast silence of the wilderness. Finally, hours later, they collapsed in the shelter of a rock formation, gasping for breath. Catherine's arm throbbed with a sickening intensity. In the moonlight, she could see that the wound had reopened, blood streaming down to her fingertips. The world tilted sideways, and she felt herself falling. Cade caught her, lowering her gently to the ground. Catherine, look at me." She tried to focus on his face, but shadows kept creeping in at the edges of her vision. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm slowing you down." "Shut up." But there was no heat in his words, only fear. His hands worked quickly, tearing away the soaked bandage, examining the wound by moonlight. It's not deep, but you've lost blood. I need to cauterize it." Through the haze of pain, Catherine understood what he was saying. She watched as he built a small fire, hidden in the rocks, and heated the blade of his knife in the flames. When he turned back to her, his face was set in hard lines. "This is going to hurt," he said quietly. "I know." She met his eyes. "Do it." The first touch of heated metal to torn flesh was agony beyond anything she'd ever known. Catherine bit down on the leather strap Cade had placed between her teeth, tasting blood and salt and copper. Her vision went white, then black, then white again. Through it all, she felt Cade's hand gripping hers, his voice in her ear. "I've got you. I've got you. I'm so sorry. Almost done. Stay with me." When it was over, she sagged against him, shaking uncontrollably. Cade wrapped her in his coat and held her close, his face buried in her hair. "You're incredible," he murmured. "So damn strong." "I don't feel strong." Her teeth chattered. "I feel like I'm going to be sick." "That's the shock. It'll pass." He shifted her more securely into his arms. "Sleep if you can. I'll keep watch." But Catherine couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her husband's face, heard his killers laughing about her death, felt the heat of the blade against her skin. "Cade," she whispered. "Yeah? Tell me something true. Something good." He was quiet for a long moment, his hand stroking slowly through her hair. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I think I started falling for you the moment you pointed that gun at my heart, and I saw you weren't afraid to pull the trigger. I think I fell harder every day I watched you refuse to break, no matter what was thrown at you. And I think," his voice cracked slightly, "I think Tom would have been proud of you, of the woman you've become." Tears slipped down Catherine's cheeks. "You're an outlaw, and I'm the sheriff's widow," she whispered. Cade tilted her face up to his thumb brushing away her tears. His eyes were fierce in the moonlight, full of a promise that made her heart stutter. "Then let them come to war," he murmured, and then his lips were on hers. The kiss was gentle at first, almost reverent, as if he were afraid she might shatter. But Catherine reached up with her good hand and pulled him closer, kissing him back with all the fear and fury and desperate hope that lived inside her chest. This wasn't about forgetting Tom. It was about choosing to live, about refusing to let his killers take anything else from her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cade rested his forehead against hers. "When this is over," he said quietly, "I'm going to court you properly. Flowers and everything." Catherine laughed, the sound watery, but genuine. "When this is over, I'm going to let you." They traveled for 2 more days, staying ahead of their pursuers by sheer will and Cade's knowledge of the land. Catherine's arm healed slowly, the pain a constant reminder of how close they'd come to death. But with each mile, she felt herself growing stronger, not despite the hardship, but because of it. On the 3rd day, they reached a small settlement called Harmony. Barely more than a trading post and a dozen houses, but it had a telegraph office, and that was all they needed. Cade sent 3 telegrams, one to the territorial governor, one to a federal marshal he'd served with in the cavalry, and one to the editor of the Santa Fe newspaper. Each contained details of Blackwood's gun-running operation, supported by the evidence from Tom's journal. "Now we wait," he said, leading Catherine to the small boarding house. "They'll come for us," Catherine said. "Blackwood's men. They won't let us live to testify." "I know." Cade checked his guns, his movements methodical. But this time, we'll be ready. They came that night, as expected. 6 men, led by Marshal Kincaid himself. Catherine heard them surround the boarding house, heard Kincaid's voice calling out, "Holloway, send out Mrs. Mercer, and we'll let you ride out of here." Cade looked at Catherine, a question in his eyes. She answered by picking up her rifle. "Together," she said simply. They fought from the second story, using the windows for cover. Catherine's first shot took down one of the attackers. A clean hit to the shoulder that sent him spinning. Her second missed, but her third found its mark. Below, she could hear the boarding house owner shouting at them to stop. Could hear townspeople emerging from their homes to see what the commotion was about. That was what saved them. As more and more witnesses gathered, Kincaid and his men couldn't risk a massacre. They pulled back, regrouping, waiting for darkness to make another attempt. But darkness brought the territorial marshal and a contingent of federal troops. Summoned by the telegrams, Catherine watched from the window as Kincaid and his men were surrounded, disarmed, arrested. Watched as the marshal himself came to the boarding house and asked to speak with them. "Mr. Holloway, Mrs. Mercer." The marshal was a gray-haired man with kind eyes and a steel jaw. "I've read Sheriff Mercer's journal. I've reviewed the evidence. And I've sent men to arrest Mayor Blackwood." Catherine felt her knees go weak with relief. Cade's hand found hers, squeezed gently. "What about Holloway?" Catherine asked. "The charges against him will be reviewed in light of this new evidence. Sheriff Mercer's notes indicate that Mr. Holloway was acting under his direction." The marshal's expression softened. "I can't promise a full pardon immediately, but I can promise a fair hearing. And given what you've both been through, I think justice will prevail." Justice. Such a simple word for something that had cost so much. The trial took place 6 weeks later in Santa Fe. Catherine testified, her voice never wavering as she detailed her husband's investigation, the attempts on her life, the corruption that had rotted Redemption Creek from the inside. Cade testified too, producing evidence of the intercepted gun shipments, the records he'd kept of every stage robbery that was actually a sting operation. Mayor Blackwood was sentenced to hang. Marshal Kincaid and his deputies received 20 years each in the territorial prison, and Cade Holloway was granted a full pardon, with the territorial governor himself commending his service to justice. Catherine stood on the courthouse steps as the verdict was read, feeling the Arizona sun warm on her face. Beside her, Cade's hand found hers, and this time, she didn't let go. "What now?" he asked quietly. She turned to look at him, this man who had saved her life, who had fought beside her, who had shown her that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. This man she had somehow, impossibly, fallen in love with. "Now," she smiled. "Now you make good on that promise about courting me properly." Cade's answering smile was like sunrise after a long night. "Yes, ma'am." He courted her in the Presidio, where they'd decided to stay while the legal proceedings concluded. He brought her flowers, desert marigolds, and Indian paintbrush gathered from the hills. He took her to dinner at the best restaurant in town, then dancing at the territorial governor's ball. He read poetry to her in the evenings and taught her to play poker on quiet afternoons. But more than that, he listened. When she needed to talk about Tom, about the life she'd lost, he didn't flinch or pull away. When she woke from nightmares, he held her until the shaking stopped. When she raged against the injustice of a world that had tried to destroy her, he met her fury with his own and promised that they would build something better. 3 months after the trial, on a clear autumn day with the aspens turning gold in the mountains, Cade took Catherine riding out to a mesa overlooking the Rio Grande Valley. There, with the wind in their hair and the vast sky stretching endlessly above them, he got down on one knee. "I don't have much to offer," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "No family name, no fortune, just a pardoned outlaw with too many scars and a piece of land up in Colorado that I've been saving for. But if you'll have me, Catherine Mercer, I swear I'll spend every day of my life trying to deserve you." Catherine looked down at this man who had become her whole world. This man who had shown her that strength wasn't about never falling. It was about getting back up. That love wasn't about finding someone to complete you. It was about finding someone to fight beside. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I'll marry you." The ring he slipped onto her finger was simple. A band of hammered silver with a small turquoise stone. But when Catherine looked at it, she saw everything they had survived, everything they had built, everything they would become. They married a week later in a small church in Santa Fe, with the territorial marshal standing as witness and half the town in attendance. Catherine wore a dress of cream-colored silk, simple but elegant, with Tom's locket tucked inside her bodice, a reminder that love didn't erase the past, but built upon it. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Cade kissed her for the first time as her husband, Catherine felt something settle inside her chest. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not the closing of one story, but the opening of another. They went north to Colorado, to the piece of land Cade had mentioned. They built a cabin there, working side by side through the winter, and in the spring, they planted. Catherine taught school in the nearest town, and Cade raised horses, breeding them for stamina and heart. Life wasn't easy. The winters were hard, the work endless. But every night, they fell into bed together, exhausted and content, and Catherine counted herself blessed. One evening, 2 years after their wedding, Catherine stood on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. She felt Cade's arms come around her from behind, felt his hand rest protectively over her slightly swollen belly. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured against her hair. Catherine covered his hand with hers, feeling the life they'd created flutter inside her. "I'm thinking about how far we've come, about everything we survived to get here. Any regrets?" She turned in his arms, looking up into those storm-gray eyes that had once belonged to her enemy and now belonged to her whole heart. "Not a single one," she said. And when he kissed her, with the mountains at their backs and the future spreading before them like an unwritten story, Catherine knew it was true. They had fought for this peace. They had earned this love. And whatever came next, they would face it the way they had faced everything else, together. Epilogue. 5 years later, Catherine stood in front of her classroom in the town of Silver Creek, watching her students work through their arithmetic problems. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the growing town. Hammers and saws, wagon wheels and voices. Colorado was changing, becoming more civilized, more settled. But some things didn't change. At noon, Cade rode up to the schoolhouse on his gray gelding, their 3-year-old daughter Emma perched in front of him, giggling with delight. Catherine's heart swelled at the sight of them. Her fierce outlaw turned devoted father, their bright-eyed child, who had inherited his stubbornness and her determination. "Mrs. Holloway," Cade called out, his eyes dancing with mischief, "I believe you have a lunch appointment." Catherine dismissed her students and stepped outside, accepting Emma's enthusiastic hug before the girl ran off to play with the other children. Cade dismounted and pulled Catherine close, kissing her thoroughly, enough to make the schoolhouse window curtains flutter with scandalized interest. "Cade," she laughed, pushing at his chest, "we have an audience." "Let them look." But he softened the kiss to something gentler, his hand cupping her cheek. "I've got news. The territorial governor is creating a new position, Chief Marshal for the Northern District. He wants me to take it." Catherine pulled back, searching his face. "Do you want to?" "I want to finish what Tom started, to build something better, to make sure what happened to us never happens to anyone else." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "But only if you're with me." Catherine thought of Tom, of how proud he would be to know that his work would continue. She thought of all they had survived, all they had built, and she thought of the future. Uncertain, challenging, but theirs to shape. "Always," she said simply. That night, after Emma was asleep and the cabin was quiet, Catherine and Cade sat on their porch, watching the stars emerge. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't walked into that general store?" Cade asked quietly. Catherine smiled in the darkness. "Every day. And every day I thank God that you did." "I love you," he murmured. "You know that, right? More than I thought I could ever love anyone. I know." She turned her face up to kiss him. "Because I love you the same way." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the night deepen around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, wild and free. And Catherine thought about how she had started as a widow with nothing, had become a fugitive running for her life, and had ended up here, stronger than she'd ever been, loved beyond measure, with a future that stretched bright and hopeful before her. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear win. That love wasn't about perfection, but about choosing each other again and again through every trial. That sometimes the greatest adventures began with the greatest disasters, and that sometimes, just sometimes, outlaws and widows could find their way to happily ever after. Part 2. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, 6 months after Cade had accepted the position of Chief Marshal. Catherine was in the garden behind their expanded home, teaching Emma how to identify herds, when she saw Cade riding hard up the valley trail, dust billowing behind him. One look at his face told her everything had changed. "What is it?" she asked, wiping soil from her hands as Emma ran to greet her father. Cade dismounted, scooping Emma up for a quick hug before setting her down. "Go inside and practice your letters, sweetheart. I need to talk to your mama." When Emma was out of earshot, Cade handed Catherine the telegram. Her hands shook as she read it. "Blackwood escaped," she whispered. "How is that possible? He was supposed to hang. Prison wagon overturned in a flash flood 3 days ago. 4 prisoners escaped, including him." Cade's jaw was tight. "Catherine, there's more. 2 of the guards were found with their throats cut. This wasn't an accident. It was planned." Catherine felt ice water replace the blood in her veins. "He's coming for us. He's already started. The telegram says a ranch outside Durango was burned 2 nights ago. The owner, a man who testified against Blackwood at the trial, was killed along with his wife." Catherine's legs suddenly wouldn't hold her. She sat down hard on the garden bench, her mind racing. They had built such a beautiful life here. Emma had never known fear, never had to run. And now, we're not running, Cade said, reading her thoughts. He knelt before her, taking her hands. I won't let him destroy what we've built. But I need to go after him, Catherine. I need to end this before he gets anywhere near you and Emma. No, the word came out sharp and fierce. We don't split up. That's how people die, Cade. That's how they pick us off one by one. Then what do you suggest? Catherine looked at their home, at the garden she'd planted, at the mountains that had become as familiar as breathing. Then she looked at her husband and saw her own determination reflected in his eyes. We set a trap, she said quietly. We make him come to us, on ground of our choosing, and we finish this once and for all. The plan was dangerous, possibly insane, but it was their best chance. Cade sent word through his Marshall network that he was traveling to Denver for a territorial conference, leaving Catherine and Emma alone at the ranch for a week. The information was designed to leak, to reach Blackwood's ears and draw him out. But Catherine wasn't alone. Hidden in the barn were 3 of Cade's most trusted deputies. In the root cellar were weapons and ammunition, enough for a small war. And Catherine herself had spent the last 6 months training with Cade, learning not just to shoot, but to think tactically, to anticipate threats, to fight like a marshal's wife who had no intention of becoming a victim ever again. Emma, blessedly, had been sent to stay with Catherine's friend Sarah in Silver Creek, safely away from whatever was coming. On the 3rd night, the dogs started barking. Catherine was in the kitchen, cleaning her rifle by lamplight when she heard them. The hairs on the back of her neck rose. She extinguished the lamp and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing. Just shadows and moonlight. Then she saw movement. A figure detaching from the tree line, moving toward the house with predatory grace. Then another, and another. They're here, she called softly, and heard the deputies moving into position in the barn and root cellar. The first shot shattered the kitchen window. Catherine dove for cover, her heart pounding, glass raining down around her. More shots followed, a concentrated barrage aimed at suppressing any return fire. But Catherine didn't return fire. That wasn't the plan. She crawled across the floor to the back door and slipped outside, moving through the shadows toward the barn. Behind her, she heard the front door splinter as the attackers forced their way inside. In the barn, Deputy Marshal crouched with his rifle ready. 5 of them, he whispered. Maybe 6. Where's Blackwood? Haven't seen him yet. Catherine's blood ran cold. Blackwood was smart. He'd send his men in first, wait to see what defenses were in place, which meant he was out there somewhere, watching. The sound of gunfire erupted from the house, the deputies in the root cellar engaging the intruders. Catherine heard shouting, the crash of furniture, the sharp reports of revolvers in close quarters. We need to move, she said. Before the barn door exploded inward, a man Catherine didn't recognize stood silhouetted against the moonlight, shotgun raised. Marshall fired first, catching him in the chest, but the noise had given away their position. Run! Marshall shoved Catherine toward the back of the barn. Get to the creek like we planned. But Catherine had taken only 3 steps when she heard Marshall cry out. She spun to see another attacker. This one she recognized from the trial, one of Blackwood's former deputies, standing over Marshall's fallen form. Catherine didn't think. She raised her rifle and fired, the recoil slamming into her shoulder. The deputy staggered, dropped his gun, and fell. Marshall! Catherine knelt beside him, her hands finding the wound in his side. Blood hot and dark, pulsed between her fingers. "Hold on, just hold on." "Go," he gasped. "Get to safety." "Not without you." Catherine grabbed him under the arms and started dragging him toward the back of the barn. He was a large man, and she was strong, but every foot was agony, her muscles screaming in protest. She'd almost made it to the rear door when she heard the voice that haunted her nightmares. "Mrs. Holloway, how industrious you've become." Catherine froze. Slowly, she turned. Mayor Blackwood stood in the barn entrance, looking impossibly elegant despite the dust of the trail and the violence of the night. He held a revolver loosely in one hand, but his posture was relaxed, almost casual. "You've cost me everything," he said conversationally. "My position, my wealth, my freedom. 6 months in that hellhole of a prison, eating slop, sleeping on stone. All because you and your outlaw husband couldn't leave well enough alone." "You killed my husband," Catherine said, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her. "You tried to kill me. Business, my dear. Nothing personal." Blackwood took a step closer. "But now it's very personal. Where is Holloway?" "Gone, just like the telegram said." "Liar." Blackwood's gun came up, pointed at her heart. "He would never leave you undefended, which means he's close. Probably heard the shooting and is on his way here right now." Catherine said nothing, her mind racing. If Cade was coming, she needed to buy time. And if he wasn't, if something had gone wrong, she needed to survive long enough to make sure Blackwood didn't walk away from this. "You know what I think?" Blackwood continued. "I think this whole thing was a trap. I think Holloway is out there right now, trying to decide how to take me down without getting you killed." He smiled, and it was a terrible thing. "But here's what he doesn't know. I don't care if you die. In fact, I'd prefer it. You first, then him, then that precious daughter of yours." Rage, white-hot and clarifying, flooded through Catherine. She lunged for the rifle she'd dropped when helping Marshall, but Blackwood was faster. His shot caught her in the shoulder, spinning her around, and she fell hard to the barn floor. Pain exploded through her, stealing her breath. She tried to move, but her left arm wouldn't respond. Blood soaked through her shirt, hot and sticky. "Not so strong now, are you?" Blackwood advanced, his gun trained on her head. "Any last words?" Catherine looked up at him, and despite the pain, despite the fear, she smiled. "Yes, duck." The confusion on Blackwood's face lasted just long enough for Cade's lasso to drop over his shoulders and yank tight. Blackwood fired wildly as he was dragged backward, his shots going wide. Then Cade was on him, emerging from the shadows like an avenging angel, his fists moving with brutal efficiency. Catherine tried to stand, to help, but the pain was too much. She sagged against a hay bale, watching through a haze of agony as Cade and Blackwood fought. They were evenly matched. Blackwood was younger and faster, but Cade fought with the fury of a man protecting everything he loved. The fight spilled out into the yard. Catherine could hear the sounds of their struggle, could see shadows moving in the moonlight. Then a single gunshot rang out, and everything went silent. "Cade?" Catherine's voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. For a long, terrible moment, nothing. Then Cade appeared in the doorway, breathing hard, blood on his knuckles. Alive. "It's over," he said hoarsely. "He's over." Catherine wanted to ask more, wanted to know what had happened, but darkness was creeping in at the edges of her vision. She heard Cade shout her name, felt his hands on her, his voice desperate and afraid. "Stay with me," he was saying. "Don't you dare leave me. Catherine, please. Together," she whispered, and then the darkness took her. She woke to sunlight and pain. The pain was overwhelming, radiating from her shoulder through her entire body with every breath. But she was alive. "Easy." Cade's voice, rough from exhaustion. His hand found hers, squeezed gently. "Don't try to move yet." Catherine turned her head slowly. She was in their bed, bandaged and cleaned, with Cade sitting beside her in a chair he'd clearly been in for hours. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face haggard. "How bad?" she managed to ask. "Bad enough. The bullet went clean through, missed the bone, but you lost a lot of blood. Doc says you'll heal, but it'll take time." His voice cracked slightly. "You scared the hell out of me, Catherine. Blackwood, dead. And his men, 3 dead, 2 captured. The deputies will be fine. Marshall took a bad wound, but he'll recover." Cade's grip on her hand tightened. "It's really over this time." Catherine closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. Relief, exhaustion, pain. It all mixed together into something overwhelming. Cade climbed carefully onto the bed beside her, cradling her against his chest with infinite gentleness. "I'm sorry," he murmured into her hair. "I'm so sorry. I should have—" "No." Catherine cut him off. "We planned this together. We fought together, and we survived together." They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other, letting the reality of survival sink in. Outside, Catherine could hear the sounds of reconstruction, the deputies repairing the damage to the house, the normal sounds of the ranch resuming. "When can I see Emma?" she asked. "Sarah's bringing her home tomorrow. I wanted to make sure you were strong enough first." Cade pulled back just enough to look at her. "She's going to want to know what happened. Then we'll tell her the truth. That sometimes bad people do bad things, but we fought back and won. That being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. It means doing what's right even when you are afraid." Cade kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips, gentle brushes of affection that spoke of his relief, his love, his gratitude that she was still here. "I love you," he said simply, "more than life itself." "I know," Catherine whispered, "because I love you the same way." Recovery was slow and frustrating. Catherine's shoulder healed at its own stubborn pace, leaving her dependent on others in a way that chafed against her nature. But Cade was patient. Emma was delighted to play nurse. And gradually, Catherine regained her strength. 3 months after the attack, she was back teaching at the schoolhouse, her left arm still weak, but functional. The town had rallied around them after word spread of what had happened. Neighbors brought food, helped with repairs, offered support in a dozen small ways that reminded Catherine why they'd chosen to make their life here. But something had changed inside her. The attack had awakened something, a restlessness, a need to do more than just survive and rebuild. One evening, after Emma was in bed, she broached the subject with Cade. "I want to help with your work," she said, "not just stay home and wait for the next threat. I want to actively make things better." Cade set down the reports he'd been reviewing. "What did you have in mind?" "There are women all over this territory in situations like I was in after Tom died. Widows, runaways, women trapped in bad situations with nowhere to turn. I want to create a network, safe houses, resources, information, a way for them to find help before they end up desperate and alone." Cade studied her face. "That's dangerous work. You'd be making enemies, men who think women are property, people who profit from others' desperation. I know, but it needs to be done. Catherine met his eyes steadily. And I need to do it, not despite what happened to me, but because of it. I survived for a reason, Cade. This is the reason. A slow smile spread across Cade's face. Tom would be proud of you. Hell, I'm proud of you. He reached across the table to take her hand. All right, we'll do it together. I can help with the legal side, making sure the safe houses are protected under territorial law. You can organize the network, train the women in the safe houses to defend themselves if needed. You'd do that? Catherine, I'd do anything for you. You know that. His expression turned serious. But I need you to promise me something. If it ever gets to be too much, if the danger becomes too great, if it starts putting Emma at risk, we stop. We find another way. I promise. They sealed it with a kiss, and Catherine felt a sense of purpose settle over her that she hadn't felt since before Tom died. She'd spent so long being acted upon, by circumstances, by violence, by fate. Now, finally, she was going to act. The network grew slowly at first, one woman at a time. Catherine started with 3 safe houses in towns across the Northern District, each run by a woman who had her own story of survival. They taught skills, reading, arithmetic, self-defense, legal rights. They provided temporary shelter, connections to employment, protection when needed. Word spread quietly, passed from woman to woman, through channels that men rarely noticed or understood. Within a year, they had safe houses in 8 towns. Within 2 years, that number had doubled. It wasn't without cost. Twice, men tried to force their way into safe houses to reclaim their women. Once, a house was burned to the ground by an angry husband, though thankfully, the women inside had already been evacuated. Catherine received threats, was accosted on the street, was called everything from an ungodly woman to a homewrecker. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop. Because for every threat, there were 10 women whose lives had been changed. 10 women who stood a little straighter, spoke a little louder, lived a little freer, because someone had offered them a choice. Emma grew up watching her mother's work, absorbing lessons about strength and compassion and justice. By the time she was 8, she could load and clean a rifle, read legal documents, and recite the territorial laws regarding women's property rights. She's going to change the world one day, Cade said one evening, watching Emma practice her penmanship at the kitchen table. Catherine smiled. She already is. But their peace, hard-won as it was, couldn't last forever. In the spring of Emma's 9th year, a new threat emerged. This one more insidious than Blackwood's violence. More dangerous, because it wore a respectable face. A group, calling themselves the Territorial Morality League, began lobbying the legislature to shut down Catherine's safe house network, claiming it encouraged women to abandon their God-given duties and destroy families. Led by a wealthy rancher named Silas Thornton, they were well-funded, politically connected, and determined. They're going to try to pass a law, Cade said, reading the latest report, making it illegal to provide shelter to any woman without her husband's or father's written consent. Catherine felt cold fury settle in her chest. Over my dead body. That's what I'm afraid of. Cade looked up from the papers. Thornton isn't like Blackwood. He won't come at you with guns. He'll use the law, public opinion, political pressure. He'll make you the villain and himself the hero. Then we'll fight him the same way. Catherine's mind was already working, planning. We need allies. other women's groups, progressive legislators, newspapers willing to tell our side of the story. You'll need to go to Denver, testify before the territorial legislature. Then that's what I'll do. Cade reached for her hand. You know what this means, right? Once you do this, there's no going back. You'll be a public figure, a target. Everything you say and do will be scrutinized. Catherine thought of all the women she'd helped over the past 3 years, thought of the letters she'd received, thanking her for giving them a chance at a new life. Thought of Emma, growing up in a world where women had choices, had power, had voices. "I'm not afraid," she said. "Not anymore." And looking into her husband's eyes, seeing the pride and love and unwavering support there, she knew it was true. The girl who had stood in that general store 7 years ago, desperate and alone, trying to sell her husband's watch for survival, she was gone. In her place stood a woman who had fought for everything she had, who had survived the worst the world could throw at her, who had built something meaningful from the ashes of tragedy. Catherine Holloway was ready for whatever came next, and this time she wouldn't be fighting alone. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale from. Are you listening at home, during your commute, or perhaps while working? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. What did you think of Catherine and Cade's journey? Your feedback means the world to us.